Okay, another story we've been long keeping our eye on is the alleged plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. So the jury in the trial of 4 men accused in this kidnapping plot has partially returned verdicts. Let's go ahead and put this Detroit Free Press article up on the screen. 2 Whitmer kidnapping plot suspects were found not guilty. A mistrial was declared for the other 2, meaning the jury could not ultimately come to a decision. Let me read you a little bit of this. They say the historic Gretchen Whitmer kidnap plot case ended with no convictions Friday, delivering a blow to the government as it failed to convince a jury that 4 militia members were domestic terrorists determined to harm the governor because of her COVID-19 restrictions. The jury declared 2 of those men not guilty, but deadlocked on the charges against the other 2 who will be retried. You guys probably remember some of the details of this case. It was announced in an FBI press conference very shortly before the November general election of Trump versus Biden. And the details were quite scary and quite stunning. What we learned is that these extremists, this is the FBI's telling, were concocting a plot to ultimately take Gretchen Whitmer from her home, that they had been casing the joint, that they had been purchasing explosives. And, you know, this was a dramatic show of their fight against right-wing domestic violence and extremism. Let's take a listen to a little bit of how that was presented at the time.
Last night, the FBI and Michigan State Police arrested 6 individuals charged in a federal complaint with conspiring to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. According to the complaint, unsealed this morning, Adam Fox, Barry Croft, Ty Garbin, Caleb Franks, Daniel Harris, and Brandon Caserta conspired to kidnap the governor from her vacation home in the Western District of Michigan before the November election. Under federal law, each of these individuals faces a term of any number of years up to life in prison if convicted. Fox, Garbin, Franks, Harris, and Caserta are residents of Michigan. Croft is a resident of Delaware. All of us standing here today want the public to know that federal and state law enforcement are committed to working together to make sure violent extremists never succeed with their plans, particularly when they target our duly elected leaders. Among other activities, members of this conspiracy on 2 occasions conducted coordinated surveillance on the governor's vacation home. Fox and Croft, in particular, according to the complaint, discussed detonating explosive devices to divert police from the area of the home. And Fox even inspected the underside of a Michigan highway bridge for places to seat an explosive. The complaint further alleges that Fox purchased a taser for use in the kidnapping and that the group successfully detonated an improvised explosive device wrapped with shrapnel to test its anti-personnel capabilities. The FBI and state police executed arrests of several of the conspirators when they were meeting on the east side of the state to pool funds for explosives and exchange tactical gear.
So sounds absolutely horrifying and sounds like an open and shut case. But then we started to learn some more details about exactly how this plot came to be. And frankly, it had a lot of echoes with the type of plots that were disrupted by the FBI during the, post 9/11 era, when they would effectively find some vulnerable young Muslim man, oftentimes encourage him in his radicalization, help him concoct a plot, and then swoop in to disrupt the plot that the FBI had created. In fact, we learned that there were more FBI informants and agents involved than there were people who were being accused of being involved in the plot. Then some of the ghouls that the FBI was working with here, you started to learn, oh, this one is being charged with domestic violence. Oh, the star witness is having to be pulled out because they're being charged with their own criminal behavior. Oh, one of the key players here, now the FBI is saying, oh, actually, they're not really our informant. They were actually a double agent because their own sort of corrupt behavior was exposed. You had someone who was effectively effectively trying to profit off of their work with the FBI and their own consulting business. And I want to give a lot of credit to BuzzFeed, which was really the only mainstream news outlet that bothered to do the work of explaining why this case was a lot more complicated than the government and most of the press was portraying it. Let's go ahead and put this BuzzFeed tweet up on the screen. This was some of the original reporting. They actually did the work of digging through what the government case was and what the defense was saying actually happened. They say when 14 men were charged with conspiring to kidnap Michigan's governor and kick off a civil war last fall, it was hailed as a triumph in the FBI's battle against domestic terrorism. But the men say they weren't plotting. They say they were set up. This tweet thread goes on to say it started when Dan, an Iraq War veteran, joined a group called the Wolverine Watchmen, looking to practice tactical training with like-minded people. But when he read their violent messages, he contacted the police and soon found himself working as a confidential FBI informant. The FBI called it Operation Cold Snap. Dan was wearing a wire when a heavily armed crowd occupied Michigan's Capitol in April 2020. Around the same time, another government informant was helping organize a national militia meeting in Ohio. One of the participants later told Dan about his plan for the Michigan State Capitol: take the building and then take effing hostages. So what they dig into is the fact that at every step along the way of this plot, it was people who were working for the FBI who were really pushing them forward, who in some instances were, gathering meetings of extremists to try to hatch these plots, who were providing them with material support. And so the defense's argument here was that, no. Yes, were they saying some basically terrible things that no one could possibly condone? Yes. Were they actually able and materially able to pull off some plot against the governor? No, they were entrapped. This was classic FBI entrapment. Now, historically, that has been a very, very difficult thing to argue. And we saw maybe no cases during the 9/11 era when you were dealing with young Muslim men in which the jury found this case to be convincing. And I do think that is an important part of this. But you had a government which was so heavy-handed and which worked with such just sketchy and nefarious type of people in these plots that ultimately the jury, even though they were very limited in the information that they were given, they didn't have the information that we had at our disposal from BuzzFeed's journalism and others, even though they were given a very sort of pro-government version of the case, they saw enough here to feel like this was entrapment, the government went too far, and these dudes were not really capable at all. I mean, it was basically like a bunch of tough-talking losers who were incapable of really sort of putting this plot together themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the way you laid it out is perfect, which is that, look, the guy who started this was Dame Dan, who started the Facebook group and then started reaching out to these people. Well, all of the defendants are like, hey, Dan, who was working for the government, is the one who pushed us to do this in the first place. That's straight up entrapment. I mean, you referenced the war on terror. I used to write about a lot of these cases. And I remember even, I was younger and a different political persuasion, and I was like, this is kind of messed up. Because you read about some 18-year-old kid who lives in Ohio, and he would tweet something like, I heart ISIS, young Muslim guy. Somebody slides into his DMs. They're like, hey man, I like ISIS too. He's like, oh, cool. And they start talking. Then they're like, hey, you should buy a ticket to Syria. And he's like, okay, buys a ticket to Syria. You show up at the airport, the moment you're trying to board the plane, boom, material support for terrorism, you're going to jail for like 20 years. It's like, would he really have bought a ticket to Syria?
Right.
Now, the argument from the government was, yeah, but he's a potential lone wolf, so it's better to take him off the street. But you can see very clearly here, it's like, well, he didn't actually have the intent in order to do that. Yeah, he was going to Syria, but in terms of what they were saying or not, it was hard to have sympathy at the time. But when you look at it now on the face, these are very, very dangerous tactics. And especially whenever it comes to this, it's very clear that these guys were, I would say, set up at worst. And at best, really what was happening here is that there were a bunch of losers, which is funny because that's actually the argument that the lawyer for one of the defendants presented to the jury. He says, Mr. Fox was a misfit who couldn't stop smoking pot. His only friends are FBI undercover agents and informants who were spying on him, entrapped him, and pushed him towards a kidnapping plot to talk tough.
terrorist mastermind.
Yeah.
Isn't this the dude that lived in the basement of a vacuum store and had to like go across the street to use the bathroom?
Yeah.
I mean, listen, you can be a loser and also be a bad person. And this is not to cast judgment like that, say these are, they were totally, wrongfully and they're great guys.
Yeah, I don't
Nobody's
think these are
saying any of that.
gents.
The real question here is are the FBI's actions actually keeping you safer?
Right.
And I think it's pretty clear, not only from the number of, the lengths they had to go to craft this plot, but also the people that they were paying and getting in bed with and authorizing like basically their own criminal behavior. I think the answer here is pretty clearly no. And we also have to keep in mind there's a lot of incentive. I mean, careers were made during the War on Terror on these kind of like splashy press conferences and elaborate plots used to freak the public out that these sort of plans are being hatched around every corner. But thank God, the good men and women of the FBI are there to disrupt it. And it turns out when you get into the details, the government, so far, according to the jury, the government behaved in a more criminal way than these men ultimately did. So you had 6 people who were charged originally. 2 of them took plea deals. They pled guilty and they cooperated. 2 of them, as I said, there's a mistrial. 2 of them now found not guilty. So that's where things stand. I just want to give you, this is also from, the reporting of BuzzFeed on the conclusion of this trial, just to give you a sense of how lopsided the trial ultimately was and how little the jury was able to benefit from sort of a full picture of the government's involvement and these FBI agents and informants and their behavior. So let me read you from this BuzzFeed piece. They say, in the government's telling, the most critical moment in the alleged plot took place late on September 12, 2020, when Foxcroft and others piled into 3 trucks and headed out to conduct nighttime surveillance of Whitmer's lakeside cottage. It was not a great success. For one thing, their companions that night included 2 confidential informants and 2 undercover agents. Some 10 additional FBI agents followed them en route, and stationary cameras mounted at strategic spots tracked their progress. For another, despite all the careful planning, the men failed to find Whitmer's house because they'd been given the wrong address. Heavy rains made it impossible for them to spot one another from across the lake as they had hoped to do. Nonetheless, the government seized on the narrative value of that outing and several times throughout the trial showed the jury a pair of videos reenacting it, except it looked a little different on the projector screen. In one of the videos, a confidential informant and 2 agents sit in a truck parked in Whitmer's driveway, which none of the defendants had ever even found. A second video viewed from across the lake shows a glowing infrared illuminator held by an FBI agent standing on Whitmer's boat dock, a vantage point not one of the defendants ever had. So instead of using our law enforcement resources to, actually disrupt things that are going on and actually go after criminal behavior, they were using elaborate and extensive amount of resources to basically help create this plot. This is what the jury has found at this point, and then to swoop in and disrupt it. The last thing that I'll say about this is I do think it's another example of complete media failure in terms of, there are going to be a lot of people out there who look at this outcome and are just going to be totally shocked. Like, how could this happen? How can you get away with plotting to kidnap and potentially murder the governor of a state? How did this come to be? And so the media does no favors when they gloss over these details, which were very uncomfortable for the government's case, because it doesn't help people understand what was going on. And also the abuse of power of the FBI and the misuse of resources that could be used to actually keep people safe. So I do think it's also a dramatic media failure that very few people are going to understand why the jury decided what they decided.
Yeah. Well, and you know why that happened. It was because they built it up this is before the 2020 election. It was presentation of rising right-wing extremism, and then it got January 6th, and then the media had to go and protect the FBI's new domestic war on terror and acknowledging the original roots of this right-wing extremism narrative and the role which the FBI played in that, and also possibly on January 6th, cannot be discussed for politically correct reasons, which then brainwashes millions of people. And like you said, I feel bad for them. If you're one of those, MSNBC libs, you're like, what the hell is happening
right
here? You're like, this country's going to hell. You don't even know the facts about exactly what happened. And from the beginning, 6-7 months ago, since we started doing talking about this case, I was clear as day. I was like, there's no way these guys are going to get convicted. It didn't seem possible to me, even with the slanted government narrative, given how many of the informants themselves were criminals, how many of them were engaged in all sorts of sketchy behavior, clear entrapment almost night and day, no matter how you feel about them from a sympathy point of view. And I think it's a real tragedy, media story, and politically, this had a big impact at the time. Don't forget how big, she was a star. She almost became the vice president.
Yeah.
Remember? I mean, she was one of the most popular Democrats in the country for a time during the whole COVID thing. So I just think that you put that all together as a very clear manipulation by the FBI. They all did this for political benefit. We all know it. They thought Trump was going to lose. They wanted cachet with the Biden administration, help protect this fancy governor, set these guys up. It's a great story. You can make your career, kind from the brass.
A lot of political careers and a lot of, law enforcement careers made from this type of high-profile plot disruption. So the incentives are all in the wrong place. Yeah. I mean, we first became skeptical of it, just so you know, this isn't some right-wing conspiracy. Right. It was actually a Jacobin article
right.
that was maybe this was a plot, but also take a look. Just be like, some of the hallmarks of exactly the tactics that they used during the War on Terror were employed in this alleged plot. And my plea to you guys is just regardless of whether these sorts of tactics are used against Muslim men or right-wing groups or Antifa or whoever it is, make sure you apply the same standard and see it consistently for, this is a complete overreach and abuse of power that only benefits the FBI and the police state and does not keep the American people safer.
Yep. Hey guys, we're going to be totally upfront with you. This is the most perilous time that we have ever operated in.
It is so difficult just to try to sort through the news, but even more importantly, to bring you accurate information as this wave of lockdown and censorship spreads across the nation.
Yeah, look, if you can become a premium subscriber today at breakingpoints.com, you're going to help us build out a vibrant, independent media ecosystem which is free of mainstream pressure. We can't tell you how important that is at a time like this.
Yep, that's right. Go to breakingpoints.com to subscribe. We love you guys and we appreciate you so much.